Gades and Lendelman. This is an unknowable number of Layman Pascals dancing on the head of some half-comprehensible gibberish pin we call the Integral Stage Meta Podcast, where we podcast podcasters, broadcast broadcasters, and generally reflect on and with the folks who are creating audio, video, and interview content in service to the inspirational, transformational, developmentational Muppet show of leading edge, full spectrum, metacognitive, and emergence oriented culture, or couture, as Tucker Walsh likes to say, because if there's one thing I know about Tucker, it's that he can't resist posturing as a sophisticate by pretending to know fancy French words. But if there's a second thing I know about this dapper documentary director, fabulous field holder, and sincere social commentator, it's that he's been doing podcast with a bunch of heart-open, shiny-faced folks, and he calls it Illuminating Life. So let's find out what the fuck's going on with all that. Hi, Tucker.
Hello, Layman. Bonjour. Ça va?
Yes.
That's all I know.
How was that for an introduction? I know your introductions are admirably succinct. You just say welcome and say the name of the person and start talking. I like that.
Is that right? Is that what I do?
I've watched several. Yeah, they're quick, and it's interesting for me because I'm a guy who hates introductions. Like I don't like the credits on the movie. I don't like someone introducing another person. So I do mine as kind of like an aggressive counter introduction. But I love how succinct yours are.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because I would say that the thing that makes you most unique in my podcast realm are your introductions. So I appreciate that your hate for introductions has led to such novelty and uniqueness. Well done, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess the first question is why? Why add a podcast to your already overloaded service to the liminal web? What was the inspiration for this?
I don't remember there being a single moment of inspiration other than I had a previous podcast that I've done called Possibility Now. I still do an episode every once in a while. It's with a man named Ethan Hughes who lives in Maine. And he lives electricity free. He's a big social justice advocate. He also was one of the first people that got me into Wilbur, and he has tons of books on integral and all sorts of various spiritual traditions. And this man is just someone who, out of anyone that I know personally in the world, he walks the talk of his ethics and his values more so than anyone I've ever come across. And he's a deeply inspiring orator, but he lives electricity free. He doesn't have the internet. He has one landline telephone. And so he calls in on the landline telephone and we record episodes together. And yeah, there's so many people. I still get a trickle of messages, even though it's been many months since the last episode came out, of people that have found that, have been moved by it, have impacted their lives, have made transformational change. So I think the podcast medium obviously has deeply influenced me over the years in terms of all the content I've consumed, especially during the COVID years. But then making that first podcast with Ethan, it was like, wow, this is a man that I just deeply love. Like I would die for this man, in a heartbeat, no questions asked. And to be able to have an hour-long conversation with him and then put it up on the internet and then have other people share with me that they were really influenced by that. Like, I don't know, that seems like one of the best ways to spend life, is to do something so simple. So it's cost-free, pretty much. And it feels like just a way to take someone who's loved me and who I love, and then to share that love with other people. And basically that's what Illuminating Life is. I was like, okay, I have all these amazing friends. Growing up, I was never a cool kid or particularly popular, but I was always well liked and I had a lot of friends. But I was quite shy and introverted also at the same time. I was when I was in my creative flow, it would bring out my extroversion. But when I wasn't in my creative flow, I would be pretty shy. And now in my life, for some reason, that's really changed over the past 4 or 5 years. I've become much more extroverted, and I have this huge social network, and I feel like I have friends literally on every continent on the planet. And so just to be able to speak with people like you, I mean, this is so cool. This is what, Tuesday morning at 8. It's 8 in the morning. I just woke up and I get to speak to Layman Pascal for an hour. And if that can be recorded and help somebody in their life, then fuck yeah, that's awesome.
You've had the experience of doing it with a co-host and the experience of kind of doing it on your own. I do one with Cheryl, so I've got kind of both of those experiences myself. Would you prefer to have a partner, or is there something you're particularly liking about just having it be your own little control space?
Well, I guess in my podcast, I see the person that I'm interviewing as the co-host because I don't have prescripted questions. There's not an agenda for the conversation, which might be a fault of the podcast. Like if honestly, if I listen back to some of them and I don't know the context of the pre-existing relationship and who this person is, it's probably less of a compelling or useful dialogue. But I think most of the people that listen to that podcast are folks that either know me quite well or they know the other person. So I almost see them as the temporary co-host. But yeah, it's a touchy or maybe a tender question that you're asking because I'm in a moment of transitioning out of various collaborations with different partners, and there's a way in which by not having a partner at the moment, it's making me step forward and really having to own the power of really just taking leadership of the space and of the execution. And that's I can really feel that growing me into my growth edge and expanding my capacities. And I would like for me with constructing consciousness, for example, the best part of the entire experience has been the collaborations that happen over Signal chat or just over random Zoom calls. It's not even in-person gatherings. So this has felt like a celebration of all the work that was done in between the gatherings with my partners that felt so deeply nourishing. So yeah, I'm also calling in a romantic partner and would love to start a family soon. And so there's a way in which partnership in general it feels like a tender and beautiful longing that I'm calling in. And so if you're listening, give a shout out if I don't already know you.
Yeah, this should just be the integral stage dating service. Like so many of the people I talk to, that's at the forefront. The idea of like dating apps is
Yeah.
the thing that's crystallizing all their thinking on profiling and development and social connection. And
Yeah,
obviously,
totally.
it's a real concern for a change compared to a lot of the stuff we talk about.
Yeah. I'm just here for the chicks, basically.
What what's your sense of the, and there's no single answer to this, but what aesthetics should a podcast have? Like, I like to ask people this because I run into two main sets of opinions. And one set is people should really put some production value into it. It should be shiny and look good. And I think of that as a kind of a TV mentality. It's attractive. I watch some of those. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which the thing that makes the podcasting medium special is it's kind of amateurish and rugged. It's just embedded in someone's life somewhere. And when a cat walks in front of the camera, I love it. I get like those
Yeah.
real podcasty vibes. Do
Yeah.
you have a leaning on aesthetics?
Yeah, for me, it's very practical because I'm a documentary filmmaker and I'm obsessed with aesthetics and beauty and cinematography. If I was to attempt to make the podcast look good, I would have to go all out and like really do it full bore. And then it would be laborious. It would probably involve some investment in different types of equipment, and it would take away the spontaneity of it. So for me, I feel like I only have two capacities: either make it look fucking beautiful or just make it look like a Zoom call and not care. So I've chosen to do the make it look like a Zoom call and not care. Um, yeah, that's the short answer. I don't ever watch podcasts, even ones that are on YouTube, like Integral Stage, for example. I would never sit there and just look at the screen for an hour and a half. Like I already spend way too much time on a screen, and I imagine so does everybody. Like I don't know anyone that doesn't feel like they spend too much time on a screen. And so for me, I guess YouTube is just a delivery vehicle, but I presume that most people aren't sitting there and actually watching the thing play out. I'm sure people actually do, but I almost want it to look ugly so that people pay attention to the beautiful leaves out of their window or washing the dishes or on a walk or doing something embodied while also listening at the same time. So I would prefer that the podcast be solely an audio experience.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I sometimes my partner and I watch them in the morning with a coffee to sort of like
That's beautiful.
boot up our social critique brains for the day.
Yeah,
But mostly for me, it's ambient. It's either something in the headphones when I'm doing other tasks, or maybe it's on a screen while I'm doing a workout in the morning or something like that.
yeah,
My sense is, I don't know how much Marshall McLuhan you've read, but there's an argument that the electronic digital medium itself is more inherently acoustic than visual.
yeah,
And like it draws down the part of our brain that learned to be super visual because of books, and it makes
yeah.
it more like a space of a person with their eyes closed. Like it's coming from all over, it's ripples
Yeah.
of sound. Even if you read something online, you say that you heard it online because it's kind of like the oral acoustic space of village life again.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. I was deeply influenced by Ira Glass from This American Life. Do you know Ira?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So in college, I studied photojournalism and I interned at NPR. And yeah, it's just, I first got in, so I started doing photography and then I started doing radio. And then I went to documentary filmmaking, which is basically combining radio and photography together. And so for me, the medium of human storytelling through audio only, just it creates a depth of intimacy. There's like a texture quality that awakens when the visual sense closes, and there's something just in the textural nuances of the voice that to me um, creates an energetic experience that maybe is more informing than the content itself often. And of course the visual layer can do that as well, but it's often I find, this is just me, that maybe there's more pattern making or assumptions or projections being made when I'm just when I'm visually seeing somebody's gestures than when I'm hearing. It's almost like the cognitive mind shuts off a little bit and it's more of a somatic experience.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I share with a lot of people this sense that I don't want to receive a phone call. Like that's overwhelming, but I want to be
Mm,
able to bathe in a world of sound and echo and reverberation. But
yeah.
I need to feel safe enough to do that bathing without this feeling
Mm,
like I have to respond as if there's someone on the other end of the phone line.
mm,
I'm curious about, there's a question about editing, and I don't know how much editing you do or don't do with the podcast. Bruce and I were having this conversation because he does a little bit on these, and I do it with the Soulmakers podcast, which is I go through and I want to some degree, take out ums and ahs because I was taught as a kid you're supposed to do that, even though I don't know if it really matters. I want the people who listen to it to think that they sound good when they hear it, but
mhm.
also because Soulmakers is a bit about creating a transmission vehicle. I want the listener to hear their body formulating the thoughts. I
Yeah,
want to hear pauses. I want to hear, like there's an intelligence in those noises. So it's
yeah.
a constant juggling act between too much and too little, and making them sound professional and making them available in their full authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so with documentary, I'm editing a film right now. I was just at the Republican National Convention and did a climate change documentary. And, so I'd interview someone for, say, 10 minutes. It was like a man on the street style interview. And then I'm finding that one, 5 to 8 second soundbite out of that whole 10 minutes. And that 5 to 8 seconds it's the seed in which the rest of that time, it's like the essence. I'm finding the essence of each person, and so I can and have normally done a highly edited version of interviews. That's like the world in which I come from, and the podcasts are almost the exact opposite, where I basically just listen back through it and I say, okay, is there anything that's really stupid? Like that? Is there anything that makes me or the other person look or sound dumb in a way that is not useful to the listener? And it's pretty rare that something like that happens, but maybe one or two lines I'll remove, or maybe if there's something that's just like, oh, that was sometimes when I share stories I get a little dramatic and I'll say something and I'll say like there was like 100 things. I'm like, actually no, there was like 12. And and so I'll cut that out because I feel like it's not actually of service to the story. But otherwise I prefer the longer transmission. And Again, I think that probably I lose people in doing that. There's a way in which if I was to go and maybe cut down a tighter 45-minute edit with somebody, it might be more useful to a larger audience, but I'm not attempting to reach a large audience in this work. I'm attempting to basically just have the dialogue between myself and a friend, and then to have them share that in a way that feels useful for them, and then to just basically share that with my social group. There's no public marketing. There's no attempt to reach a broader audience, and for me, that's enough.
Several times John Vervaeke has said to me that he thinks people won't pay attention to something more than 70 minutes. So he likes to keep Voices with
Mm.
Vervaeke kind of tightly packed. But I'm always suspicious about that, given A, the popularity of Joe Rogan, but
And
B,
Daniel
the fact that I
Schmachtenberger,
don't
yeah.
listen to podcasts, it's not concurrent. Right, I sample a
Yeah.
bit. Maybe I listen to 5 minutes, and a week later I listen to 10 more minutes. I'm not sitting down with it and tracking all the way through. I'm sampling.
That's interesting. I do the opposite. I have a hard time jumping back and forth. Actually, in my life in general, I'm quite good at multitasking and moment to moment oscillating between different contents. But with podcasts, I like to just sit down and listen from start to finish, and I usually wait until I have the time to do that. Because to me, it's almost like I allow myself to be taken in the flow of the experience, and it's like traveling to a different culture, or basically it's all state experiences, right? And so everything is a different vibration or an energy or a different state, and when I can allow time to drench that state into my being more and more, it creates an intimacy that I lose if I jump around too much. That's just me.
What do you talk about with guests before the recording comes on?
Usually we have a conversation. Like my friend Hannah, for example, I think this was my second episode. We were at a dinner party and I started talking about OCD. Haven't mostly had in the past various forms of OCD, and she was asking me about what some of them were. And then she was like, we discovered that we had the exact same OCD patterning, which is awesome. And so I was like, let's record a podcast about that. That feels super weird and novel and not something that I get to talk about often. And we could frame it because of Hannah's capacities. We could frame it and we could illuminate new ways of making meaning around the OCD, which transforms the experience itself. So it's not just about the cognitive perspectival taking, but it actually shapeshifts our direct relationship with the experience itself. And so a lot of the times it's a conversation that happens that feels really good. And then there's just a felt sense of this is something that wants to be shared, or this is something that wants to be recorded. And then we take the essence of that first conversation and just blossom it into a full recording. But I don't tell my guests really anything other than I'm not going to script anything. There's nothing to do. Just show up and be yourself, and let's just drop in and see where it goes.
The concept of illuminating life is potentially very broad. Um, how do you adjudicate what goes in or doesn't go in? Is there a hidden, more specific theme to this show? Is it just here are Tucker's friends? What would signal to you that something doesn't belong in illuminating life?
Yeah. I'm enjoying this because historically in my life, I take my creative pursuits very seriously, and they're very well thought out. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of heart and integrity in them. And for this, I'm just like, I don't know, man, it's a podcast, and I just have a friend on and I just ask them questions, and like something just comes out. And sometimes it's really amazing. And sometimes yeah, that was pretty good. Like that was a good conversation, but I don't necessarily feel like, wow, that was an earth shattering experience. But more often than not, it's just in the moment, intuitive felt sense of, it's like when you're sailing, right? Like good sailors, they can have all the charts, they can know the different patterns of the wind directions, but ultimately in the moment, it's just a sensing of which way the wind is blowing, and then it's attacking to adjust in the little micro movements often. And it feels like that when I'm engaged in a dialogue with someone. It's just like, where is the aliveness flowing, and trusting that the directionality of the aliveness itself is more important than the overarching content flow. However, I do sometimes listen back to the recordings. I'm like, wow, we really just went all over the place, and it's not. It doesn't feel ADD, but it feels more like sometimes I listen to a podcast where they're talking about one specific book or topic or something like that, and it just feels really honed in, and there's something that is really useful about that approach. And it's just not an approach that I've taken thus far, but that could change.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think one of the things I like about the integral stage is the idea that there's sub-series. So, because somebody's not necessarily going to be
Yeah.
interested in all the same things. So some of them, like a lot of what we do now, are interviewing people about their books, which is extra work for me to process their book and have good questions. But the apparent specificity of we're going to talk about your book allows us to range as freely as we want. It still seems like we're on topic, as
Yeah.
opposed to another series like whatever we do, the liminal cafe thing, where it's just, hey, we're just here. Let's just say whatever we want to say.
Yeah.
There's something I like. It's almost a perverse pleasure in having an ostensible tight focus that allows you to really just roam freely, and then you can just point to this as the topic you're pretending to be focused on.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't really listen to Joe Rogan or those really long form podcasts, but there is something about the meandering quality of them that I find is both their downfall, because I don't have 3 hours to listen to a meandering conversation where I'm not sure where it's going and I'm not sure if it will have value to me. It's very rare that I have time and space to really drop into something like that. But there's also a quality in which you get these amazing, 10-minute chunks that are just like these brilliant little moments in time that probably never would have come about if the person was just reciting their typical sound bites about their latest book or whatever it is.
One of the reasons I started doing the introductions the way I do, in addition to hating introductions, is because of something I saw Charlie Rose do years ago when he
Oh
had
yeah.
his old show. And he would summarize all the basic answers you could give to the questions in the question. So you had to come up with something special. Like he was talking to an athlete and it goes, so in addition to going out there and giving 110% and playing every game, what did it take to win that Super Bowl? And the guy can't use any of his stock answers because you summarized a lot of it in the opening. And now he has to look for something else. There's something I love about that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. This is a different note, but it just arose. I think you asked something to the effect of an intention behind the podcast. And this isn't necessarily, well, it was explicitly behind the podcast, but it's really more of a life intention, which is to be this community weaver of this global village. And ultimately the vision that feels most alive and is like erotically calling me to it like a lover is a regenerative in-person intentional community. But that intentional community is a node or is a lighthouse of this larger global village. And so right now I excuse me, I personally don't feel ready. Like if somebody was to hand me $3 million in a plot of land, I don't feel ready yet to take on a project of that scope, of that scale. I still feel like I'm maturing in my community building, facilitating leadership capacities. And, but I do feel like this global village is being woven, and, there's a liminal web, but to me, I have these different social groups, and there's a lot of various Venn diagram points in which they connect, and also some differentiations between them, like the Burning Man community, and then the Meta Modern community, and then the Integral community, and then the Stages community, and then my Boulder community, and the Bill Plotkin Vision Quest animism type community. And so if I can just sort of like pluck individuals from these different networks and then weave them together through Illuminating Life, it's not that there's like a formal new collective that is being structured necessarily, but on an energetic level, on a soul level, it's like different people are being called into this larger tapestry or mosaic. And there's a way in which it feels like the humans that they're, because like each person also represents different archetypes or different energy or different pattern structures, and it's almost like that global village that is constellating and formulating and clashing and cohering is just setting the soil. It's like it's creating a nutrient dense soil for this land-based concrete version of a regenerative village to eventually blossom. That's the inshallah attention, God willing.
Yeah, I can see how the interviews you've chosen so far can each be regarded as a kind of research for a project like that. And that each
Hmm.
person brings in particular energy and insights and webs of connection and experiential backgrounds. But I'm also curious what maybe they all have in common. Like when you think back over this set of Illuminating Life guests, what have you been hearing from them? If they were speaking in a common voice, what are they bringing to you?
Mm. Yeah, I would say I tend to be attracted to people in this sense, in the podcast sense, in a way where it feels as if they've discovered and are discovering. It's a verb. It's not a process that necessarily has an endpoint. But they're discovering, but have really illuminated their own uniqueness, their own way of being of service, their own Bill Plotkin calls it their mythopoetic identity, or their medicine that they can bring to their village, to their people. And yeah, to me, one of the intentions of the regenerative village that I would love my children to grow up in is the intention of the collective is to help each individual discover their fullness, their wholeness, their uniqueness, and that which only them can specifically bring into this world. That which, if they were to die, or if they were to not discover and to actualize their fullest potential, the entire cosmos itself would be missing out on their gift. And the people that I feel that I am drawn to and want to invite into the podcast format are people that I feel like are in the act of discovering, embodying, and transmitting their gift into the world. And that feels like it's matching and mirroring my own developmental journey, you could say. And so like when the two meet each other, they bring out more of themselves. And I think that's the power of collectives, is it can not only mirror and match where we're at, but also expand and stretch us into where we want to go, and also provide other templates and archetypes and possible shapes and textures for the ways in which our gifts could be transmitted. And yeah. I'm laughing because I'm
One of
like,
the
this all
things,
sounds very
yeah.
serious and sounds very like ah, but it's both. It's both at the same time. There's like a really powerful, deep sort of soul level drive, and then there's just, I don't know, I like this person and they're my friend, and I just want to hang out and talk with them, and let's record it and put it online, and like who really cares if that's all it is? That's great too. And I think when the seriousness and the play interpenetrate and just become this one kind of silly but profound dance of life, then yeah, that's the sweet spot for me.
That definitely reminds me of my overall impression of you. Uh,
Yeah.
I remember us staring into each other's eyes in Sedona for a while, and this imagery I was getting of like a Himalayan warlord or something like that, Buddhist
Am
Mongol
I
king.
smoking
Uh,
opium?
yeah. And like have that like right under the surface of this character who looks like a kind of, Jesus hippie neo Woodstock kind of character to some people at times. And like the interplay between those levels, I think does frequently hit a very interesting sweet spot, which to me is like peak Tucker.
Nice. Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah.
One of the things I find that goes on a lot in person to person exchanges, even through the Zoom medium, especially if you have high quality psychological, energetic, emotional people, is you get
Mhm.
other kinds of transmission dynamics. You get subtle things, you get altered states, you get consciousness stuff. Do you find that goes on for you in interviews? And if it does, do you tend to keep it on the down low, or do you have an impulse to kind of mention it in the conversation?
Yeah, it's hard not to mention it sometimes. I have some friends that their entire podcast is purely about creating a field that is evoking a state experience that is connecting people to the ground of wholeness, or whatever phrasing they might want to give it. And I don't think that I'm yet confident or comfortable enough with evoking something like that. I don't know. To me, I guess I would. My desire is to do that without necessarily saying that. And it doesn't mean that we need to avoid the topic of spirituality. It comes up in pretty much every podcast. But to just be in the whatever transmission of aliveness is flowing, and to trust that that will be felt and sensed without needing to necessarily name it as something that is happening in the moment. And maybe that goes back to my documentary filmmaking. It's like when I'd rather just tell the story about this beautiful human, and then through the music choicing and the editing and the pacing and the clips that I use, and like the editing process itself is evoking a specific state transmission. But the film itself isn't saying like, and now you're going to be experiencing a deeper sense of embodiment, and now you're in this line, your heart's going to open. It's just kind of like this, it's foregrounding the story, and then trusting that the experience will happen without the person maybe even knowing it. And for some reason, that's what I'm more drawn towards, but that might also be a reflection of my some shadow elements in me that are afraid to step confidently into being seen as some sort of a teacher, or with some sort of spiritual authority, or something like that.
My feeling is that we've had plenty of people who stepped forward with spiritual authority throughout the past, and at least half the time it was bullshit. So I really want people to show up with the capacity and not advertise it, and have people
Hmm.
discover it if it's really there.
Hmm.
I think that's important for rebuilding and reauthenticating spirituality, especially transmission and respect dynamics in spirituality going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that sometimes it's not what's needed. When folks are having awakening experiences, I can sometimes feel, and I felt this myself and can feel this a lot in our collective. It's like the whole world gets filtered through that prism. But also, like, I don't know. Um, there's so many, sometimes having just a purely intellectual conversation for the sake of just purely being in the intellect, or just wrestling, not for the sake of like having some deep, meaningful experience, but just because the animal body wants to wrestle, and it's completely mundane and there isn't like a mystical undertone to it. That to me feels just as important and beautiful and useful for my life as filtering reality through this sort of spiritual mystical lens, which I do a lot of as well. So it's not like I'm necessarily missing that.
I have with some people, they have a strong multi-system capacity in themselves, and they're sensitive to subtle dynamics and all that kind of stuff, and you can get into interesting flows with them very fast. But I also interview a lot of people where they're very solid, or they just want to talk intellectually about developmental theory or something like that. And one of the reasons I usually run to about 90 minutes for the average interview is it takes me about 75 or 80 to get to a spot with those people that I want to be. Like,
uh,
they may not know that they're participating, but I'm digging for something energetically with them. Whether they know it or not, for me, the satisfaction, the nourishment is getting to that place where I start to feel this reverberation in depth. And so if I'm doing it with somebody who isn't really an active participant on the other side, it takes almost that full 90 minutes to get there.
yeah, yeah. I think, because I know most of these people quite well that I've interviewed so far and that I plan to interview in the future. I filter out folks who I feel like I'll struggle to get to a place. There's most of the people that I have chosen to interview, I trust we can drop in pretty quickly into the type of experience that I'm sensing would be useful for others to listen to. And there's been a couple episodes where I haven't published them just because I felt either the conversation became too esoteric, mystical, and kind of lost the thread a bit, but it was a beautiful experience for myself and the other person, or because I felt like the content it didn't sort of reach a bar that I felt comfortable publishing. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm curious. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's what comes up.
I'm not sure if I even asked a question. So
I don't think you did. Yeah. I mean, you interview a lot of people. Yeah. I think I choose in my life in general, whether it's with the gatherings or the things I'm doing, I'm choosing to be highly curative. Is that the right?
Curative, okay. Sounds right.
Curative. Yeah, something like that. And yeah, why am I doing that? I think it's because I don't know why I'm doing that, but that's just the path that I'm taking. And so I really admire folks like yourself who just interview, you have hundreds of episodes now, and you talk to schmucks like me and take the risk of damaging your solid reputation in the liminal web community by having on Tucker Walsh. And so, yeah, bravo to you. But I would curate myself out if I were you.
Well, any reputation I have is from consistently damaging my reputation.
Yeah, that's true. It kind of plays into your hand. This is all part of your act. I got it now.
That's right.
So I'm just
social
a pawn
anti-fragility.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's these two different dynamics looking at the field, or whatever we want to call this whole thing. One is developing high trust subnetworks and really finding people who are energetically and emotional and integrity and consciousness reliable that maybe we could build things with. And the other aspect is there's a huge number of people playing in this space or adjacent to this space. How do you create the biggest tent possible on the one hand, but also these concentrated, highly reliable places you'd actually want to anchor yourself in on the other? So I sway back and forth in both those territories as either I have no choice or it's some kind of service.
Yeah. 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 It's kind of, I think one of my deepest desires is probably the only real desire that I have left that really feels worth living for is to start a family, to start a biological family, and to have that family exist within the context of a village type family. And so for me, a lot of what I do is I'm sort of curating from the perspective of family, and like, oh, is this person my brother? Is this person a potential sister? And I think there's I actually just experienced this a couple of days ago where I recognized that I was sort of subtly projecting this desire for a sister-like connection with somebody, and they weren't necessarily consenting or aware of that dynamic that was unconsciously playing out within me. And so there's a risk in creating and calling in a depth of intimacy sort of right from the start, because for some, their constitutions aren't ready or available, or their life circumstances aren't available to kind of dive into that. And, often a true intimacy, I don't even know what that means, but a true intimacy, it takes time, like time and space and different contexts to really develop in a deep and meaningful way. So there's this longing for the experiential felt sense of family and all the different fractals of possibilities in which that could manifest. And the podcast feels like one way of calling in my, if not my brothers and sisters, maybe my aunts and my uncles or my cousins, and inviting them into the family and just creating little links of intimacy that, again, even if nobody listens or watches the episode, it's still serving its purpose in that respect, because the call itself is doing that function.
Um, Bunch of time interacting with Alexander Bard and his work, and it's so laden with sometimes off-putting and heavy repetitions of concepts and attitudes and new phraseology. But one of the words they use that I really appreciate is tribopoesis. And this idea that we are entering an age that has to and is going to inevitably resurrect some archaic human organizational patterns. But the thing that makes the new tribes different than the old tribes is we don't simply inherit them, and they're not
Hmm.
just blood based. There's something we
Yeah.
have to artistically create as a participatory act, and that is intensely emotionally exciting for me.
Yeah, exactly. That feels like the um yeah, like I can feel it in my body of just this sense of a volcano like amount of energy and enthusiasm and eros that is ready to be in that type of a process together. I mean, it's already playing out all the time, and we can continuously sort of both illuminate it, point to it, and construct new forms of it, which is delicious. And it feels like that's what my entire life is about, in a sense, is creating these different contexts for intimacy to deepen through unique experiences that need to be different enough from each other in order for that intimacy to like seep into different parts of our being. And so some can be through play, some can be through ritual, some can be through prayer, some can be through fighting and conflict and tension, and um, some can be through solitude and feeling the grief of the lack of the intimacy. You know, it's like it's all part of the one holistic dance of life loving itself more. And that to me feels super, super juicy.
Mm. It's a little like automated robot in the back of my mind now that's like, help Tucker get an appropriate mate. The first thing I thought was, see if you can get him to take his shirt off. That's probably a good signaling device.
Okay. I can do that. Yeah.
um, right now, you're a guest and I'm a host. We're talking about situations in which you have guests, although we can think of our guests as co-hosts. I think that's a good way to approach it. What's easier for you, being a guest or being a host?
Being guest, being well, being a host, I don't really call myself a host, but being the interviewer, that's something I've been doing since I was a teenager. And, you know, there's many times when I would interview someone. I had the best, I still do. I used to speak about it in the past tense because I took 5 years off from filmmaking, but now I'm going back into it. So I need to update my vocabulary. But often I would be talking to someone, and sometimes they'd be, a famous sports celebrity, or it would be somebody that's, a homeless person on the street. So it was like the full spectrum of the human experience. And often when I interview someone, they'd be like, "Wow, I felt like a really amazing therapy session." Like I feel like I got to know myself in such a new and exciting way than what I had previously. And so for me, that was it's always come very second nature. But one of the things that I really stepped into and fallen in love with recently is including my own story in the interviewing process. And I think that's why it sometimes feels less like there's a host or subject dynamic, because often when I hear somebody speak, it invites or evokes in a memory or an insight or a story that I want to share. And I've felt more and more confidence now being able to share that, and having done that enough times over the past few years, and to see the impact that has, and to be told that folks want more of that. It's like built this storyteller that is turning the camera towards myself now and inviting in my story as a part of the other person's story. And I really like that integration and that weave or that co-creation aspect. In most cases, it feels really good, and it feels constructive for the other person as well. I think that I had a lot of caffeine this morning, so sometimes I'm noticing that my mouth keeps moving when my body is like, "You should stop talking now." I'm just going to stop talking.
Yeah, I've gravitated toward like mutual sharing, sort of like the ping
Yeah.
pong ball bouncing back and forth, provided that because I code, I think, a lot of my understanding in autobiographical chunks.
Hmm.
And I have a strong feeling that a lot of what one really ought to share is terms of verbal content around your beliefs and conclusions, but it's embedded in your life and it goes to some subconscious part of the listener. But you also
Yeah.
don't want to get carried away in uh, narrativizing your life and using up too much space. So I always feel like if I can bounce back a small nugget of autobiography to keep the
Yeah.
play going, that's usually the best.
Yeah. A lot of the philosophers or spiritual teachers that I'm drawn to include their personal life story as part of the transmission of the teaching, you could say. So Bill Plotkin's a great example of that. He has all these books about vision quest and doing different soul making type practices. And then basically every other chapter is a chapter about his own life story that brings people through the methodology that downloaded into his system through his own life experience. And for me, there's a risk in that, and people trying to model themselves off of the experiences of others, especially I think with spiritual teachings. If somebody talks about, oh, then I had this insight, and then the next insight was this, and you try to kind of pattern recognize your own teacher, and often the world is far more complex and diverse than that. And at the same time, I think there's something in remembering that these aren't just spiritual experiences or soul experiences, but these are human experiences, and that our story as a human vessel going through whatever dimension of reality we're experiencing is part of the integration. It's like the novel experience and the integration of it can happen simultaneously rather than be like separate and then have to be woven together afterwards. Something like that.
Scott Schwenk and I were having a conversation the other day about my Gurdjieff book and the way that I he was noticing that I was definitely emphasizing spiritual transmitter as character. And we were both
Mm,
kind of appreciating the extra layers of transmission that are possible when you get both the humanity and the idiosyncratic flavor of the person. So you're
yeah.
not necessarily modeling yourself on their conclusions or their events, but you're getting a sense that there is a real person there and that this is something that happens to a person and that your particular personhood and flavor is
Yeah.
part of what should be transmuted in your own case as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Adyashanti is another example of someone who does that really well. Um, yeah. I'm thinking about Ken Wilber right now, and I don't really know anything about him other than he was a bodybuilder and kind of a sexy nerd in college. And then, of course, Grace and Grit. He talks a lot about his relationship with Treya. Um, yeah, but that's an example of like you read a whole book, 700 pages on integral theory, but there's no real personal anecdotes about how that applies to a human's life.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with like book writing philosophers. Obviously, they're going to lean a little bit more in that direction, but the parts where you get a bit of person peeking through are my favorite parts. At some point, I stopped reading the text of Wilbur's books and started reading the footnotes because I wanted to
Yeah,
see what he was working on right now, not what he was presenting. And you get
yeah,
little bits of his comedy and his aesthetic play, but you don't get very much. And I've had this problem with some of my favorite spiritual teachers. They
yeah,
want to they act like they're representing a set of ideas or a lineage, which they are, but then sometimes they make a weird joke. And then this extra radiance comes out, and you're like, I want that guy to be my teacher. And then it goes
yeah,
away because they don't value it. I really want them to value it.
yeah, totally. Even thinking about different elders in the CC community, someone like Kim Barta, who I love so much. I've done a number of trainings with him, and but I know very little about his personal life. He holds a very clean space, and there's a very defined sort of boundary between his personal life and his work. And then someone like Jeff Fitch, it's like often there's a total interpenetration, it feels like, or a blurring of all the boundaries between a personal story or an anecdote from what he's working on or experiencing in the moment and the teaching itself or the pointing out instruction that's happening in the moment. And for me, that really lands for me. It really works for me. But I love that there's both, because I think the clean space orientation is necessary and helpful. And some of my friends really resonate with that, and they struggle with some of Jeff's, because there's a risk in projecting or of when the boundaries are blurred, then it's kind of confusing. Is this about him or is it about me? And so I think there's each provide a different medicine.
Yeah, in some ways, I think it takes more sophistication to draw from or join somebody like Jeff, right? That the person who's keeping that clean, kind of professional space to be of help to others, and it gives you confidence and it gives you an orientation in a field, similar to what a host does on a show. That's really nice for a lot of people. But if you
Yeah.
sort of already don't need that as much, then
Mm.
there's like a higher challenge, which is finding that person and really understanding them. They're just going to meet you straight on, like Jeff does, with all his intelligence and all his vulnerability and all of his idiosyncrasy, just right out in the open in this incredible way.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Puts me in mind of whether I like being a host or a guest, and I think I definitely prefer being a guest. It's
Yeah.
easier. I feel like I don't have to plan. I can just perform the Layman Pascal character. Um, I'm not really, I don't relate to being a host, right? Like I'm
Mm.
curious. I have a lot of curiosity. I can go to the points about someone else that I'm intrigued by. I can perform. I can kind of make a space for people, and I play this game of like trying to trick other people into being the Buddha. Like I sort of get them to be the transmitter to me somehow.
Yeah.
And I like people. But other
Yeah.
than that, I don't want to be the interviewer. It's just something I'm capable of doing.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, when you say play the character Layman Pascal, do you consciously think about which character you want to play and which version of Layman Pascal wants to come out? Or is it, yeah, do you prep for any of
It's
this
not
stuff that you do?
it's not tactical, and I say character almost just to make sure I've included that possibility, because there is a performative dimension to what I do.
Yeah.
But the performance is pretty close to what I'm
Yeah.
like. Although there'll be elements of, things that are going to come up in a domestic situation don't necessarily come up here. I have other modes and moods. I don't select a character, but I don't know. I feel called upon to privilege certain modes when I'm in
Yeah.
recorded conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other intentions, or the things I love about podcasting, is that often it brings out the most evolved version of myself. Like, I feel like it's asking me to show up and shine in a way that if we were just shooting the shit right now and it wasn't being recorded. An example of that is yesterday I was just reflecting to a friend how I wanted to say the word like less, like I just did. And I noticed that when I'm talking in this mode or in podcast mode, there's probably a 75% reduction of the use of that word. And I feel like my vocabulary is a lot cleaner and clearer and crisper. And yeah, I wonder what I, there's a friend, he's in the liminal web. I'm forgetting who exactly it was, but he basically records every conversation. So if you go have tea with him at a coffee shop, he'll just sit there and record it, and then he'll read the transcript afterwards. And it's interesting because you sort of have the raised stakes of, there's some possibility that a third party will be listening and judging this experience, which could bring out shadow elements of feeling, self-aware or whatever. But most of the time now, it just brings out a version of myself that I fall in love with more. And so podcasting for me is a way of falling in love with myself and almost inviting this different novel expression of myself to become more fully present and available for life. And it's doing that for the other person as well. It's almost like
Yeah,
dating,
I
like
find
when you go on a first date. Like sometimes I just went on a first date a couple of weeks ago, and I was awesome. Like I loved how I showed up, and she loved how I showed up, and it's just like, yeah, this is great, And that pressure of the situation can make us shine. It can ask us to step up.
that distinction is a really interesting one, because like I had a conversation the other day. Sometimes we'll set up these calls and people aren't sure they want to be recorded yet. So you start and you talk, and then at some point you go, well, do you feel good if I turn the recording on? And then something changes, and it's not dramatic, but you go from this
Yeah.
intimacy where you feel safe to this thing where you're sharpened. And you like
Yeah.
you maybe lose a little bit, but also now you're on best behavior because you're mediated through the idea of the possible other, which
Yeah.
tells us something about the structure of metacognitive awareness in general. And there's a
Yeah.
beauty if you can handle it without getting anxious about the judgment of the other, then I think you're right. Like you do start to bring your best self. You just bring a little bit more edge and precision to what you're trying to show up as.
Yeah. And it's why sometimes I refer to it as my constitution or my personality structure loves being a film director, is because you have to give client pitch presentations, and then you're on set and you have to go and you have to, there's like 100 people and you need to manage all the moving parts, and everyone is asking for the best of you. And when you bring the best of yourself and invites the best of others, and then it creates this amazing, you call it a state experience or just an experience of life in its full richness. And I love the pressure cooker of those types of experiences. And again, when I'm in my, I don't want to say mastery, because I definitely don't feel like a master, but there's like a level of confident execution that is reliable when I'm stepping behind the camera and doing filmmaking. There's a way in which, there's not a stress attached to that. Or if there is a stress, it's like a healthy vibrational energy that is motivating the situation. It's not detracting or draining the situation. And I think gatherings can be like that as well. We're together for 3-4 days. There's all these amazing people there. I want to impress them in some level. And can I use that, even if it's an earlier part that is feeling that, can that be transcended and included into a more, can it be used as a transformational vehicle rather than as a, something that is devolving us into earlier structures?
Yeah, that's really interesting for me. Like when I think about spaces that I run, and then I'm always trying to get this balance, right? You don't want to overdo being the guy at the front of the room or on like the elevated pillow or whatever it is. So you want to undermine that all the time, but you also want to use that because it's part of a function that we collectively perform. And also it asks you to be nearer to your best self in certain
Yeah.
ways, which is
Yeah.
then not just for you, but a service you provide to that group of people as well by trying to be a sharp sword rather than a dull sword.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yeah. I think for me, I'm not an adrenaline junkie in the sense that I don't, necessarily go skydiving or whatever. But it's almost a subtle energetic adrenaline junkie where I love the pressure cooker and the feeling of the being in a collective space, whether it's a film set or a gathering or a podcast, where there's a sense of, there's a heightened level of aliveness. And I've always loved that my whole life. It's not, even when I'm in solitude, or that's what some of the Bill Plotkin work was really impactful 4, 5, 6 years ago, when I was going through a lot of grief and depression and like a death and rebirth type experience, being in nature and just like going and like kissing the trees and like just being fully in the mud and the dirt. And it's like this heightened aliveness that maybe is rare for us to healthily. There's less places in modern society for us to healthily express that. There's kind of it's almost like the antidote to a monotony daily, just getting up and doing the daily pattern routines of the modern world and the modern life. And yeah.
Well, let's bring this thing to an end so that you've got some free morning to play with. Beautiful to talk to you as always. Last chance to take your shirt off. All right, there he is, ladies.
I don't think that's gonna sell this.
I think the gesture itself is good.
Okay.
Look at that. He's playful and bold.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, this has been great, man. Tremendous fun as always. Thanks for talking with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Layman. I enjoy it.